All right, we are live. So would anybody like to introduce our topic first? Or should we just introduce ourselves?
I think, and then we can just like introduce it through there.
Oh, okay. All right, well, real quick, I think just so that we can start our faces, my name is Jessie Blau. Go ahead, Amy. You can introduce yourself, maybe.
I'm Amy Backhorse.
Ashley.
Here.
Okay.
I'm Kaylee Chaco.
All right, awesome. And we are just going to dive right in. Okay. All right. All right, so our group is doing on-task behavior. It consists of Amy Bachers, Ashley Greer, Jessie Blau, and Kaylee Chancellor. Okay, all right, Amy, you're set.
Okay, all right. I'm just going to get us started by kind of talking about some of the key concepts that we looked at in our study. So we kind of examined the effects of reinforcement on self-monitoring, the accuracy of self-monitoring, and Ashley's going to go into that a little bit more later. But just as an overview, basically this is about self-management, so the personal application of behavior change tactics that produce a desired change in behavior. Self-monitoring is probably the most well-researched of the self-management techniques. And so it's a procedure where a person systematically observes behavior and records the non-occurrence or occurrence of a target behavior. And it's had many successful applications in several areas, including overeating, smoking cessation, on-task behavior in classroom, decreased talkouts, and aggression for students. We're going to talk about 3 articles in this presentation. So the first one is from Moore et al. 2013. And so they studied the efficacy of self-monitoring in increasing on-task behavior in general education classroom. So for this study, it's kind of uncommon for a self-monitoring study on-task because the students that they selected had no disabilities or behavior disorders. They were just low performing academically based on their scores on standardized tests relative to their academic achievement in the classroom. And so the researchers employed a multiple baseline design across subjects. So they began with baseline, self-monitoring, and then follow up a few weeks later to see if the results maintained over time. So the students were taught to self-monitor using a motivator. So it had like a vibrating timer. And so they would record when the timer went off and a self-recording sheet. And so they were handed out the self-monitoring packet at the beginning of the class from the teacher. And they did momentary time sampling once every 3 minutes in a 30-minute session. They would mark whether or not they were on or off task. And following the 30-minute session, they would plot the results on a bar graph and submit it back to the teacher. So for the results of their study, they found that on-task behavior was maintained or increased for all 3 during the interventions, and results were maintained at follow-up. And students and the teachers completed a questionnaire on feasibility and treatment acceptability. Students said self-monitoring was easy to use, and teachers said it was non-intrusive. So it had a high degree of social validity. And just this table below is kind of shows the mean percent of on-task behavior, showing that for all of the students, self-monitoring increased the percentage of on-task behavior, and it was maintained at follow-up. The next study is from Willis and Mason, 2014. This is also self-monitoring on-task behavior in a classroom. This was in a general education science room. And so this 2 students were aged 14 and 15, and one had a diagnosis of a learning disability and the other one had ADHD. And so the researchers employed an ABAB withdrawal design, starting with baseline, self-monitoring, second baseline, and then self-monitoring again. And so the students were taught to self-monitor using a Samsung Galaxy player with the iConnect app, which typically the iConnect intervention is a package where the students will also meet with like a guidance counselor to kind of discuss the results. But in this particular experiment, they just used it for like the timer to do data collection. So each of the sessions was a 15-minute session. Momentary time sampling was used. So once every 5 minutes, the students would record their behaviors on or off task. And so the researchers found that there was a positive, stable improvement in on-task behavior with self-monitoring. I didn't go into it on the previous slide, but they had also included a generalization variable of disrupted behavior just to kind of see if there are carryover effects in terms of self-monitoring, like affecting whether or not the kids were a little bit less disruptive as well. And the results for that weren't as clear. And I didn't really go into it here because it didn't really have particular relevance to our study. So like the previous study, it had a high score on treatment acceptability on a social validity scale. And then as you can see, there was a stable improvement for both of the students in their on-task behavior. Finally, the Graham, Day, Gardner, and Hisson 2010 study, which kind of has the most relevance to ours, because these authors also tested the effects of reinforcement plus reinforcement with, self-monitoring and self-monitoring with reinforcement for accuracy. So the authors evaluated the effects of self-monitoring and self-monitoring with reinforcement on the on-task behavior of 3 10th grade students with ADHD. So the setting was a special education study hall, and they examined whether or not reinforcement increased the accuracy of self-monitoring. They used an alternating treatments design, baseline, self-monitoring alone, and self-monitoring plus reinforcement. And so for the data collection system, there was 10-second whole interval recording for 20-minute sessions. Students wore headphones with prompts to record whether or not they were on or off task during the intervals. In the self-monitoring plus reinforcement condition, the student compared scores with an observer at the end of the session. So for all 3 of the participants, on-task behavior improved. Self-monitoring alone was effective in increasing the on-task behavior for 2 of the participants. The third required self-monitoring plus reinforcement to increase on-task behavior. So for John, as you can see, so there's a functional relation between self-monitoring alone and on-task behavior, because his mean percentage went up from 51% baseline to 92% in the self-monitoring alone. For Paul and Linda, their scores, you know, they had a clearer jump in terms of the percentage of on-task behavior in the self-monitoring plus reinforcement phase. So a functional relation was demonstrated for them in that condition. And next is, and here's a graph of it, just the percentage of on-task behavior across sessions. Okay, next, turn it over to Jessie to discuss the study we based our replication study on.
So we based our study off of Otero and Hott's article that consisted of differential effects of reinforcement on the self-monitoring of on-task behavior. Within the study, participants included 3 general education students that were identified by their classroom teachers as having frequently off-task behaviors, which consisted of Josiah, 5th grader, failing his math and reading class, despite having high or average standardized achievement testing. Bobby, a 4th grader who frequently had off-task behavior that consisted of looking around the room, inappropriate vocalizations, and talking to his friends. Landon was a 3rd grader who was the 3rd participant who was having behaviors that consisted of fixating on non-essential elements of assignments and doodling while instruction was going on. Observations were done in 4 general education classrooms, each consisting of 22 to 25 students. And observations were also, or had also occurred at similar times throughout the week. So our focus and target behavior of the study is on-task behavior, which is operationally defined as orientating toward the source of instruction, following directions, and exhibiting behaviors that serve to complete tasks at hand. We also were checking to see if another target behavior, or the study was also seeing studying the off-task behavior of the individual, which was any behavior that did not qualify as on-task and were incompatible with on-task. The data collection procedure consisted of an alternating treatment design, an intervention applied under 2 conditions: self-monitoring alone, SMA, and self-monitoring plus reinforcement, SMR plus. Momentary time sampling was used, which consisted of 20-minute sessions that were divided into 1-minute intervals using a data sheet to score as on-task and off-task. Both the investigator and student used the same data sheet. The experiment began with collection of baseline. SMR plus, a student received reinforcement if their scores matched the investigators for at least 80% of the recorded intervals and or observation. During SMA phase, there was no accuracy feedback that was given back to the student, and comparison immediately following session in SMR plus. So here are the 2 treatment phases, just broken down a little bit more. In SMA, the student and observer both collected data on occurrence or non-occurrence of the target behavior. But once again, as stated before, no feedback was given from the observer. During SMR plus, a student and the observer both collected on occurrence and non-occurrence of the target behavior. The student and observer compare the scores at the end based off the number of agreements. And if the student and observer scores matched 80% or more, then the student would then receive their reinforcement. Moving on to IOA and intervention fidelity. For IOA, to calculate IOA, both investigators record on-task behavior for 25% of the total intervention sessions. The calculation consisted of a number of intervals that were agreed upon, divided by the total number of intervals, and then times that by 100, which averaged out in the end to 98.3%. For intervention fidelity, students taught how to self-monitor with treatment checklists, training sessions where students and investigators went through checklists and ensured that all the steps in protocol were completed prior to treatment. The results show that SMA was effective for 2 of the students for increasing on-task behavior. SMR plus, however, was effective for all 3. SMR plus increased on-task behavior for 2 students when compared to SMA, and the opportunity to receive reinforcement increased the accuracy of self-monitoring. And there you can see each of the participants, and this table shows a mean of percentage of intervals on task. As you can see, compared to baseline, there was a functional relation between all 3 moving, besides Landon. Landon showed a more of a functional relationship with SMR plus. Here is another table showing the mean match scores and percentage of intervals on task by condition. And here is more of a line graph to gain another better visual of each of the students, as well as the same table as you saw before. And then Ashley will go in to talk about our replication study.
Now, as part of the replication and going over the procedures and measures. The purpose of this study was to increase on-task behavior with a self-monitoring system. So before we decided, we had all agreed in the group that we needed something to help us be more on task when it came to doing our homework and other assignments for school. And so we wanted to increase that on-task behavior, homework, assignments, quizzes, projects, and tests. So when it came to the Otero study, we were interested to see whether it was going to be affected by offering that tangible reinforcement that for the accuracy of our recording. Over the participants, settings, materials, and so on. So as far as the methods go, the participants that were included were 4 students from our class, which is 611, section 808. That's Amy, Haley, and we all signed up during the first week of class based on our time zones. The study took place in each of the students' homes and were located in various regions of the United States. Whereas Amy, Jesse, and Kaylee are all from Illinois. Like I said, we picked this based on our time zone that we lived in, which is the Central Time Zone, and the observation took place while we completed coursework. Were needed for a replication study were a timer that vibrates, the self-monitoring recording form, a condition indicator card, a visual of each student engaging in the on-task behavior, and the reward ourselves. So for the timer that vibrates, we had all decided to use an iPhone. We had one and it fit the function of the timer. This is an example of our self-monitoring recording form. It's very straightforward for both the student and the observer to use. Condition indicator card, so you can see that we have the self-monitoring alone and the self-monitoring plus reinforcement, and these cards were shown on the table or on the student's desk just so they were aware of what we're a part of. And these are all of our pictures of us engaged in the on-task behavior, and this was just set on the table of what we were supposed to be doing, and it was to help keep us on task. As we're able to submit tangible rewards, Amy picked, and this was for the reinforcement. So this is when the accuracy had to be 80%. And I picked almond M&M, picked peanut butter cups, and Kaylee picked Bunch of Crunch. So you've heard us say on-task behavioral several times. So on-task behavior is defined as any instance in which the student is fully engaged in the instructions being presented, directions given, and completing the assigned task or task that is located nearby or at hand. This includes, but is not limited to, writing notes or assignments, materials needed to complete assignments, reading through the materials pertaining to the assignment, and completing all assignments through Blackboard modules. For the data collection, we used a sample procedure that it consisted of 21-minute intervals. And the timer vibrated, the participant or not, they were engaged in on-task behavior at that very moment. So when the timer vibrated, you were either on task or off task, and that's what you wrote on your data sheet. We did take baseline before we got started with the intervention and once it was stable, started the intervention, and that was when students and observers simultaneously recorded whether or not we were on task during the loan phase, self-monitoring with reinforcement phase. And during that self-monitoring reinforcement, students and observers compared their data, and that was where the accuracy had to be 80% or above in order for us to receive our tangible reinforcement. And once again, this is an example of our data collection sheet. The design of the replication study was an alternating treatment design, comparing the differential effects of self-monitoring alone and self-monitoring with that reinforcement. Gathered in treatment each participant randomly before intervention began. The conditions of the study, like I said, they were self-monitoring alone and self-monitoring with reinforcement. So during the self-monitoring alone phase, both the student and the observer collected data, but there was not a tangible reinforcer given at the end of the session. But during the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase, the student and the observer compared data and they collected the accuracy data. And the student and the observer had to have at least an 80% agreement or greater for the student to receive a picked out. Checklist just to help with treatment fidelity and to help train the observer and the students on what they were being asked to do. So we had to gather materials, set the timer for 1 minute, press start. When the timer goes off, you press stop. You look to see if the individual is engaged in on-task behavior or not. Mark an X in the corresponding box on the data collection sheet. If they are not, then you mark an O in the interval box. And then you immediately restart the timer until completed. So for the baseline phases, I already went over how it was kind of gathered, but one thing to note here is that there was no contingent consequence for the student of what the accuracy was. So we just wanted to see where everyone was as far as their on-task behavior before the intervention began. For the phases of intervention, I've already discussed the treatment phases, but I'd like to note here that the treatment phases were assigned using a random number generator. So if the number 1 and 5, the student was assigned to the alone phase. But if the number was 6 through 10, then they were assigned to the self-monitoring with reads. And the corresponding condition card was shown during each phase. So for the accuracy of the self-monitoring, this is where we were able to see if the reinforcement and that self-monitoring was really increasing our on-task behavior. So we compared the observer and the student's data on-task behavior by session using and divided by the total number of intervals and multiplied that number by 100, and that's how we got our accuracy. Along with the accuracy, we also collected IOA data for 25% of the sessions. And this is not to be confused with accuracy though. So for IOA, we had a group member that was not being monitored at the time and on those 20-minute sessions. And so the liability observer, and we also had our primary observer. And that's where those two people compared their results and how we got our IOA. So the formula that we used for that was the number of agreements divided by the agreements plus disagreements, and then we multiplied that by 100. So for treatment integrity, I went over the checklist that we had did. We developed that checklist just to make sure that everyone was on this, is how data collection was to go, the data collection sheet, each of the treatment phases, and what was supposed to happen, and about the study in general. Go to each of the individuals and then we can talk about their results.
Okay, so to start with mine, I think it might be easier to go to the graph with the accuracy range. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so Kaylee's going to kind of go more into this with the results for everyone, but as you can see from my data, from the baseline average, I started with a 97% accurate. I mean, 97% of the intervals were like on task, with a baseline range between 90 to 100%. So just right from the start, I think the effects of being observed for the baseline probably increased my on-task behavior to a level higher than it would have been without being observed. So in the self-monitoring alone condition where there's no reinforcement given for accuracy, my score was 92% of intervals on task with a range of 90 to 95%. And self-monitoring plus reinforcement, 98% of the intervals were on task. So I think it's kind of difficult to really say if there's like a functional relation demonstrated there, just because there's just not much variability in the data between pre and post treatment. The average on-task score was higher for reinforcement being available for accuracy of self-monitoring, but as you can see, you know, the actual numbers, like the amount of variability is kind of small, so it's really kind of difficult to draw an exact conclusion. Now, if you want to go back to like the graph to show that. So yeah, so as you can see, the on-task behavior started pretty high, was a little higher in the reinforcement available condition, but I think it's kind of difficult to precisely say there was a functional relation there. So next I will turn it over to Ashley to discuss her results. Oh wait, accuracy of self-monitoring, sorry. Go back, I apologize, sorry about that. And for the accuracy of self-monitoring, there was, so in the self-monitoring alone, where there's no reinforcement given, for my scores matching the observer, it was lower, so it was 92%, and then in the reinforcement condition, it was 98%. So, yeah, so I guess you could, but even so, there's still not that much there. Anyway, let's move to Ashley.
So for me, as you can see from my data collection, my baseline, the first session of baseline was actually my group member, so it was 75%. Remember that night had a lot going on, which was pretty typical, so I guess it was accurate. But as you can see, it did increase, and so I had a range of 75% to 85% in my baseline. Phases go. You can see that they were pretty stable throughout, ranging from about 80 to 90 during the self-monitoring alone, and with the reinforcement, had from about 90 to 100. So as you see, so my baseline average was relatively low, 1.7%. That increased with the self-monitoring alone phase, which was 85%. And when reinforceable, my on-task behavior was a lot higher at 95%. So there is a relation there with the reinforcement that was given to me after the session. Accuracy data.
Sorry, go ahead, Ashley.
Kind of varied. So my reinforcement average was 92%, and it ranged from 90 to 95. So I guess it was relatively high, and it beat that 80% that we were really looking for. And during the self-monitoring alone, my average was for accuracy data, which was 96%, and it ranged from 90.
Okay.
Then we'll turn it over to Jesse now.
Alrighty, so here is my data collection. As you can see, I also had kind of similar baseline data compared to Ashley. It first started off pretty high. I think obviously we'll go later into the limitations and the conclusions and discussion about like an observer effect on how our target behavior was produced or presented. So here you can see my graph. As you can see, during baseline, it was relatively lower compared to that of the interventions phases. So it ranged from, let's see, my baseline average was about 80.9%, and it ranged from 75% to 85%. With the self-monitoring alone, it averaged about 90%, so not that much of an increase, but you can still see an increase in the on-task behavior, and that ranged from about 85% to 95%. But as you can see, there's more of a functional relation. Not a great one, but with the SMR plus, it averaged out to be 98%. and the range was from about 95 to 100%. For accuracy of self-monitoring, for the reinforcement phase, it was once again a lot higher, so about 98%, and the range was 95 to 100. The SMA averaged out to be 94%, and it ranged from 90 to 100%. Kaylee?
Okay, so as you can see from my data, there's not much variability from baseline to the intervention phases. It's actually slightly lower for the self-monitoring alone phase, with an average of 93, whereas baseline was 96%, and slightly higher for the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase with an average of 99%. So just slight variability. And for the accuracy of self-monitoring, kind of the same thing, just being observed in general, which we'll talk about during limitations. But so 99% accuracy average during the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase, and slightly lower 96% during the self-monitoring alone phase. Okay, so now we'll talk about the conclusions of our study as well as limitations. So Amy's average on-task behavior dropped from baseline at 97% to the self-monitoring alone intervention phase at 92%. However, she showed a slight increase in the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase. Both Ashley and Jesse showed improvements with each intervention, but the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase was higher than both baseline and the self-monitoring alone phase. My data is fairly stable throughout, with a slight decrease from baseline to self-monitoring alone from 96 to 93%, and a 3% average increase during the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase. So overall, improvement in on-task behavior was observed across all participants in the self-monitoring with reinforcement phase compared to baseline, but very slight. Ashley and Jesse displayed increases in both phases, whereas Amy and I showed a decrease from baseline to the self-monitoring alone phase. As a result of the study, we were able to conclude that self-monitoring may increase on-task behaviors. However, supplementing reinforcement with a self-monitoring intervention has a greater effect on behavior. In our current study of the effects of reinforcement on the accuracy of self-monitoring, our results were variable. Majority of participants, Amy, Jesse, and I, more accurately recorded our on-task behavior when reinforcement was provided at the end of each interval. However, Ashley was more accurate during the self-monitoring alone intervention phase. So some limitations to our study were uncontrolled variables. For instance, each participant completed her session at different times of the day. Also, just the participants knowing we're being observed for the specific behavior may have affected the outcome of our results. Participants' results may indicate that they remain on task at a higher rate than normal due to being observed by another. Reactivity, as described by Cooper in 2007, is the effect of an observation and measurement procedure on the behavior being observed, which is highest when the person being observed is aware of the purpose. Also, the study done consisted of children as participants rather than adults. We're more prone to staying on task, as well as the reinforcers may not be as motivating for us as they would for children. So those are just some limitations we came across in doing the study ourselves. So that concludes our presentation.
Awesome. I'm going to... Sorry guys, I just came back because they logged me out. All right. And that would be the rest of our presentation. All right.